Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Teaching Through Close Reading, an online professional development seminar sponsored by America in Class from the National Humanities Center. My name is Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs at the Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Now, for those of you who are with us on Tuesday night, I ask your indulgence as I introduce the National Humanities Center to the folks who have joined us for this part of our two-part seminar. First of all, I want to say that the National Humanities Center is located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. It is the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. What that means is that we are a private nonprofit organization. We're an institute for advanced study, which means that we run a fellowship program that brings scholars to the center from this country and abroad to research and write on topics in the humanities: history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, all that sort of thing. We opened in 1978. About 1,300 scholars have worked here since then, and they've produced about 1,300 books as a result of research done here at the center. Now, the place may sound like an ivory tower, and from these pictures you can see that it looks like an ivory tower, but the founders didn't want it to be an ivory tower. They wanted it to connect with a wide range of audiences, and they're particularly interested in connecting with teachers. And we do that in a number of ways, and you can find out how we do that by going to americainclass.org. That will land you on this page, and from this page you can gain access to all of the programs and resources that the National Humanities Center offers teachers. Now, I want to highlight one of those resources, America in Class Lessons, because that resource is particularly important for the work we're doing right now. In our exploration of Common Core state standards, teachers have told us that they have a difficult time finding materials to use in teaching close reading, teaching through close reading rather, particularly in American history. Well, America in Class Lessons will help you solve that problem, because at America in Class Lessons you will find historical documents, literary texts, visual images, all in American history and literature, set up for teaching through close reading. So this will give you access to resources, historical and informational texts in particular, that you'll be able to use to teach through close reading and address Common Core standards. These are set up for use in your curriculums. We have understandings. They're built around understandings and central questions. So they're really set up for teaching in a unit or a lesson. So please check out America in Class Lessons. You'll find 11 lessons there now. Stay tuned. More are coming. Now, when we finish our seminar this evening, we urge you to go to the Teaching Through Close Reading website, the website from which you entered the classroom and got your text. There you will find a recording of the seminar and the PowerPoint. And I urge you to take a look at that PowerPoint. I think there'll be some slides in the PowerPoint presentation tonight that you will want to use as you prepare lessons along the lines of close reading. You will also find in the website an evaluation, which we ask you to complete and send it to us. You can do that online. It's very important to us. We pay attention to what you tell us in those evaluations. After we receive your evaluation, we'll mail you a letter that you can submit to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation in this seminar warrants. Now, let me explain how the seminar will work tonight. We're going to define close reading. We're going to illustrate some strategies of close reading, and we're going to provide you the opportunities to apply those strategies. And we're going to be giving you that opportunity through the chat function of our website here. And the way to chat with us, put your cursor in the area that I've bracketed in green in the lower right-hand side of your screen. Type your message, hit that send button to the right, and your message will appear in the larger box above. I will be following the chat all evening, and I'll be bringing it into the conversation at appropriate times. So please, feel free to make your comments, pose questions, and respond to our questions through the chat function. Now, a word about goals. As you know, the Common Core state standards in English language arts and history seek to ensure that all students are college and career ready in literacy. And the Common Core seeks to do that by promoting close, attentive reading, which will in turn foster deep and thoughtful engagement with high-quality literary and informational texts. To instrumentalize those larger Common Core goals, our goal this evening is to model what it looks like to read rich, difficult historical and informational texts and frame the sort of questions that meet the Common Core. So that's what we'll be doing in our seminar this evening. Now, in our forum, you raised some questions and you had some comments that I think we'll be able to address in our seminar tonight. First of all, some of you asked, just what is close reading? Well, we're going to be able to answer that question for you. Another participant wrote, in my classes, I use The Economist, Florida Trend, Congressional Quarterly, The Hill, etc. How can I adapt and adopt such resources to meet state testing issues? By state testing issues, I assume that they are related to the curriculum in Florida here, and we are going to talk about how to relate teaching through close reading to the kind of unit, lesson, and lesson understandings that might be asked about in state testing. Furthermore, another participant wrote, I would like to learn more about techniques for active reading. We'll be providing you some of those techniques. What are strategies to effectively break up long readings to maintain student focus and prevent intimidation? We'll be dealing with that. That issue of intimidation came up in a number of comments. Most of my students are loath to put their eyes to paper, and when they do, they skim something once, and since the text can be challenging, judge themselves deficient and say they can't understand the text and give up. I'd like to have more tools to use to encourage and support students in close multiple readings. Well, I think we'll be able to provide you those tools and offer you some way to help overcome that sense of intimidation and deficiency that students often feel when confronted with a challenging text. Another participant wrote, just the idea that you read different texts in a different manner was a revelation to my students. They prefer to start with the first word, end with the last word, and not look back at the text ever again. I'd like to come away from this seminar with some more strategies for them that will help them decipher texts that they usually avoid or just give up on. I think we'll be able to help with that challenge as well. And finally, I'm interested in learning about teaching students specific strategies for analyzing literature and other texts without making students feel like they must find the right answer. I'd like them to understand that they can appreciate and enjoy literature at its face value, but that delving deeper can provide greater enjoyment and insight. Well, those are the kinds of challenges that we hope to address this evening, and to help us address those, we are pleased to have with us Lucinda McQuiston, Professor of English Emerita at North Carolina State University. Cindy was a fellow here at the National Humanities Center in 1984 and 85. She's written widely on women's literature and the literature of the South. We couldn't put all of her publications on this slide, but we did include Daughters of Time, Creating Women's Voice in Southern History. So let me find Cindy's name here on the list, and I will turn the program over to her. Let's see. Okay. Cindy, you are now in charge, so please take us through this. How do we do close reading?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on a topic that is or can be, I think, fun as well as useful. And we're going to try to boil this down to real effective strategies that students can use to read, and that you can use with them to help them get the most out of their reading. Let's start with the definition. When we do close reading, we go through a text carefully, examining and putting together all the striking elements of the text that produce its meanings. And let me stress here what that means. Striking elements of a text are something that any reader can find. I think that's one of the most important things to say about it. Just what is a striking element? It's anything that strikes you. It can be a word that has color, a word that has what I would call visibility. It helps you to see something. An action word, a word that has shock value, a word that is simply very unfamiliar to you, a word or a phrase that doesn't seem to be there. It's out of order with what else is there in a paragraph. And those kinds of striking things, that's where we begin, and that's where reading begins closely, is simply to begin to make a fabric list of all those different kinds of uses of language that are striking to you. You may miss some, but if you are really simply being asked to take a look and find and put together those elements, those words and phrases and sentences that strike you, then we can all do this. This is something that takes away the guesswork. You're finding the evidence. And when you have your list or your notes on striking elements, then you begin to use them, put them together, group them, ask, are there words in all this list of mine that seem to go together? Are there words that contrast with one another? Are there words that seem to set themselves up in some very pointed way to emphasize a point through repetition or a number of other strategies? And once you begin to see the patterns and make the connections and use your observations as evidence, then you gain a clear understanding of what the author's ideas and purposes are. And that's why we do close reading, to come to these kinds of understanding. So that's our definition.
Yeah, if I could interject here, Cindy,
Sure.
that your discussion of striking elements, I think, is very important and is a tool that can help teachers overcome, help students overcome that sense of intimidation students might feel when confronting a challenging text. As you said, everyone can go through a text and find something striking within it. So that, I think, should give students a sense that they can master these texts. I see something striking in there, I will bring it out. And so I think that's a really good idea to keep in mind as we guide students through texts and as we try to help them overcome that sense of intimidation they may feel.
Okay. Now, you face many challenges in doing close reading. How much can you do in the amount of time that you have? Generally, you're going to be needing to select excerpts from a text or parts of a text, and how do you make that choice? How do you select manageable excerpts that illuminate the themes that you want to stress, or the ways in which one text will relate to another one that's coming down the road, or goals that you or your unit have for things? What constitutes a manageable excerpt, and how can that excerpt really work and do the work for several other parts of a text that you may not have time, at least in class, to work on? And how can you direct the discussion to these kinds of text? So when you are looking for a manageable excerpt, you will be looking for something that illustrates key points. You will almost always have a very particular end in mind with what you want a text to do. So what excerpts really help to pinpoint the keys? And then another question that you will always face when trying to pick a text or a part of a text is how much what I would call extra textual materials, contextual materials, are you going to have to include in order to help students make sense of a text? How much do you want to feed them ahead of time? How much do you want to lead them? How much do you want to come only from inside the text itself? What critical information from beyond that print on the page is necessary for them to understand? Not just vocabulary, but time periods, questions of genre and form that may determine how a text is set up and works a particular way. How much of that are you going to need to do with your excerpt? In close reading, we want the students to be able to get into the text. We want them to be able to break it up and break into it to find what is there. And so the matter of context and how important and necessary it's going to be is a very important one. We will be looking for specific understandings when you choose an excerpt, and of course you will also want a reading that has the kind of richness in detail that is going to help you to show the students how to recognize a striking element when it's right in front of them. And so your textual materials need to be able to illustrate those things. So all of this is to lead to the last point on this particular slide, that what you want to do in teaching close readings is to learn how to ask the students the kinds of questions that will engage them in the text. So shaping and framing questions with understandings in mind and goals in mind, and also with engagement in mind. How do we get the students to want to get in there and do the kind of treasure hunt for evidence? And learning how to frame the questions is really the key to all that. So when you have your excerpt, it needs to be one that you yourself can ask a lot of questions of and start shaping those questions with your own students in mind, so that they can do what you will have done and go to the text with those questions and start looking for answers. Okay, we now have a kind of little chart that shows how this process works. And the first thing I would say about it, the process is, it's when you're trying to create, okay, how do I as a teacher do this? It's kind of a chicken and egg sort of situation, and that's why we have these arrows that go up and down. We are going to be analyzing text. We are going to be shaping an understanding statement, a statement which interprets and gives into words the key ideas we want to take from a text, and we are going to be developing close reading strategies for the students, strategies that will involve questions in order for our students to come to those understandings. We ourselves might not come to those understandings ourselves until we have done the close reading strategies ourselves, and so we will be doing the same things our students will be doing. We'll be going to the text, looking at it, looking at what's there, and figuring out how to ask questions that will lead to seeing very sharply what is there in order to understand, to analyze, and then to understand the text. So that's our chart. And to some degree, your questions and your strategies will be guided by what your whole unit has to do, the other texts that you have chosen for your students, and how you want this particular text to relate to other texts. If there are unit goals that are demanded of you, that your students come out with a certain understanding of certain concepts, then that's going to be guiding the kind of understanding they can come to and the kind of questions you will have to them ask. But I would also say that if you are letting and leading your students to look for what is striking and then to put what is striking into patterns and connections, that it is very possible that they will not need to be given so many presuppositions or be spoon-fed, and that they will be excited to realize that they can come up with very good interpretations based on evidence and observation. So that's our process. There will always be a kind of balancing of different kinds of questions, and two basic kinds in particular. That is, first, what are the questions that students can only answer and only need to answer by referring to the text itself and nothing beyond it. And then, of course, there are what we might call concept questions, questions that a student could answer about that text by drawing on information that they know, either through your having given it to them beforehand, or they know from their own experience certain things that enable them to answer questions about that text without really looking deeply into and only at what they see on the page for that text. So those two different kind of questions, notice we can give an example of that from Frederick Douglass's narrative that we'll look at a little more detail later. If a student is reading a particular passage from Douglass's narrative in which he's talking about how he learned to read and write, they can see within that passage itself and without any outside information the kind of image that Douglass is creating of himself. And they can be asked questions and find evidence to show how does he want to look? What picture of himself is he creating? And the words and the descriptions and the images and the figures within that one passage will allow them to answer that question. A concept question might be, why would slave owners consider it unsafe to teach slaves to read? And it certainly relates to the narrative in this passage, but a student might know about the laws against teaching literacy from historical context, and so they might be able to answer that kind of contextual concept question without close reading the text itself. So,
Cindy, if I could interject here, that is a very important distinction within the Common Core: text-dependent questions and concept questions. And on Tuesday night when we did our seminar on fiction, there was some confusion about those. So why don't we stop here and ask if everybody understands that distinction between text-dependent and concept questions. Everybody familiar with that? If you have any questions about that, let us know, because that is a very important point in Common Core teaching. They really want us to focus on text-dependent questions, questions that you can answer only from the text and that direct your attention deeply and sharply into a text. Everybody feel comfortable about that? If you do, why don't you, okay, concept is outside of the text. Correct, yes. That is true. A concept could relate to the text as our model question, our example question does here, but it is something that can be answered without reference to the text if a student has prior knowledge. Okay? Any other questions about the distinction between concept and text dependence? Anything else?
And text-dependent questions are going to be questions that ask the student to answer the question using the text itself as their evidence.
Right.
And so that's an important point for that as well. Okay?
Right. The concept question to be used could refer to a text too, but for supporting evidence. But the concept can be it can be answered independent of it. Okay. Here, what is the benefit of using only text-dependent questions versus a mix of text-dependent and concept? Cindy, you want to tackle that one?
Well, sure. I think there will be times when you want your students to have a kind of tunnel vision because you want them to respect and feel that the text itself as a kind of organic whole is dynamic in itself in terms of how it is operating. Very often the text itself will give us the kind of rich answers about a writer's strategies and intentions that really focusing pointedly just on what is in the text will be extremely rich. I don't think it's a matter of using all text-dependent or mostly pre-knowledge type information to come to a text. I think there is almost always going to be a balance, and I also think it will always depend on the text itself. For some texts, it's pretty impossible to stay within it without giving students the kind of guided information that is what I call extra textual, and there's certainly no good reason to keep that from them. But to let the text itself show what it's got within its own strategies that relate to how it was written and how it is making its point. Because remember, when you're doing close reading, you're not just trying to summarize main points. You are trying to get at the how and get at the why a piece of written language is able to do what it does and have the impact that it does. And that's what critical analytical reading of text is all about.
Yeah, and I would also point out that we're not doing close reading in a vacuum. When you teach American history, for example, you're going to be using close reading as a tool to get to some larger historical understanding. And we are going, in our seminar this evening, we're going to be talking about how to use close reading as a way to get to that larger historical understanding, how to focus your close reading questions on the details that will help you get to that understanding. And of course, to get to those historical understandings, you're sometimes going to have to ask concept questions. Now, we have another question here. Is text-dependent literal only, concept inferential? I don't know, Cindy, would we use the word literal here? Concept questions, yes, they can be inferential. I'm not entirely sure what's meant by literal here.
Well, I don't, if I'm understanding it correctly, the text-dependent questions are not at all going to be only literal, because one of the points we're making about text is that through language tools, and we'll be looking at a lot of these language tools, students are going to understand connotative levels and inference that comes out of language itself. And so learning what those strategies are certainly going to take students beyond literal and the denotative meanings there. We're really looking for connotative connections that take place among the phrases and patches of a text.
Right, right. And then we have another question. Is the emphasis for close reading on primary documents? Well, you can do close reading on primary documents, as we'll see, but you can also do them on what you would consider secondary sources, as we'll see later on this evening. The point of our seminar tonight is that one of the points we want to make is that you know, close reading is usually associated with literary interpretation of literary works. Well, we are going to explore how you can apply those same techniques to works that we would definitely not call literature. We'll get to that in a moment. So, Cindy, shall we move ahead then?
Sure. Here's a point to make, that not every text is appropriate for close reading. You're going to, and it is a matter of choosing, and also of you know, what text are your students going to have to read, because they have to get certain sorts of information, and so within that paradigm of what all the different kinds of texts you're going to have, close reading will work, I would say, for most of them, but not for all. If they have very little to talk about within them in terms of their strategies, the how and why a writer has made these choices in what he has written, then it's not going to really repay you that much to have a close reading exercise. And you might want to do something else with that text, to have summaries, for instance, instead of close reading and interpretations of text. But most text will have strategies of organizing and structuring and using imagery and figurative language and listing and organizing that do repay really looking at the bones of that reading for evidence and for patterns and for meaning. So keep that in mind.
Okay. If I could just interject here for a moment, so if we go back to that previous slide. The last item on that last slide there about students' ability, that raises the issue of text complexity, which, if you know anything about the Common Core, looms large in the organization of the Common Core. We're not going to go into text complexity tonight, but there are a number of websites that offer advice on how to gauge the complexity of different texts. Different states have done them for their teachers. You can go online and find them. But that point that Cindy was making about text being complex in a variety of ways, that is the key to finding a text that is appropriate for close reading. Okay.
Okay. And here are simply some of the contextualizing elements that you will want to bring to your students, and the degree to which you want to bring them in depends very often on the text itself. as to is the time in which it was written, and the place in which it was written, and the audience for whom it was written, and the purposes. How important are these for first readings? How important are they for the interpretive function that you want from the text? Very often in a history course, and certainly in literature courses, that adding these contextualizing elements enriches the understanding of the text, and so it's a balance.
Cindy, I hate to keep interrupting, but you're giving me so much information here, so many questions. If we could go back to that slide, would it be fair to say in general that these sort of contextualizing elements, while they can be important literary works, they often loom much larger in historical and informational texts? Is that a fair distinction to make?
Well, I think generally it is, and I think the expectation is that it is. It might depend on how you're using a text. If you're reading the Scarlet Letter because it's part of the dialogue about freedom in the 1850s in America, then you may very well see the contextualizing elements as just as important for a novel as another primary text about slavery, a speech, or even a secondary interpretation of the slave period. So it's certainly when we're studying history, we are studying context, and so it wouldn't be surprising that you'll have more of this to be giving your students when they are doing their close reading. But the close reading of history texts, and even, for instance, a secondary text, a historian talking about a certain battle, might very well give you a lot of richness just within the text itself without a lot of context. Okay? All right. Here they are, language tools to consider when framing close reading questions. And there are lots of them on this list. There are ones that you might have more questions about than others. I'm not going to try to go through and give definitions of these, but we will be giving examples of how to use these in informational and history-based texts tonight. So one of the ones that I like to think about, because I think our students have trouble with these, and I think in history text and informational text, the question is, well, is there a tone to this text? I mean, it's just information, right? Is there a tone? Well, there might very well be, but students very often have a hard time coming up with names for different tones and for different moods, and for what is voice in any sense. And so it might be nice when you're giving students the task of is there a tone in here, to give them some choices, give them some different ways of thinking about tone. Is the tone sarcastic? Is it didactic? Is it authoritative? Is it questioning? Is the tone disdainful? Is it detached? Is it friendly? And if you will give your students those words, then they can match those different choices of what the tone might be to words which will establish the tone from within the text. So having a kind of arsenal of descriptive words to describe tone or mood, which is very often the atmosphere. Is the mood terrifying? Is it peaceful? Is it tense? Is it warm? Is it welcoming? Is it hostile? So that's something you might do with that particular language tool.
Okay. Yes, I was going to say, are there any questions about any of these? This slide is very rich, throws a lot at you. People are asking if this slide and the whole presentation is going to be available. The answer is yes. The recording of the presentation and the PowerPoint will be available on the seminar website after the seminar. So you'll be able to plunder everything from this. But are there any questions about any of the language tools listed here before we move on? We can put, there's a question here about the list of tone words. We can put those on the form. So sure. Cindy, if you'll make a form entry. What I was going to say is that you'll want to brainstorm yourself, okay, looking at a text itself.
you'll want to do some brainstorming to get that matter of tone down to something specific. Because students, you know, they'll come up with such generic ideas about tone unless you can get it very specific. But brainstorming with your text in mind will help you make that list, but we'll put it on the forum too. That'll be fun.
Okay. And my colleague Karen Koplik has already posted the presentation to the website, so you can go there immediately after the seminar this evening and find all of this information. Before we move on, Cindy, could you talk a little bit about strategic silences? What are we looking for there when we look for strategic silences?
Well, that's one I like in particular because a strategic silence in a text is when there is something missing from it, either because the writer intentionally makes a decision to withhold information, or the writer assumes you already know the information, so they're not going to put it in their text, or it's a strategy to create surprise later. But it's a great question to ask students simply, what is not there? And that's part of reading too. Part of reading is not just saying what's there, but what's not there. It can be as simple as, what information would I like to have when I'm looking at this paragraph that I don't have? What does the writer leave out? And then the question is why? Yeah, it might be a flaw in the piece of informative writing itself, which would help you to judge the writing. Or the writer might very well have a purpose for that kind of silence. Satirists often will not identify themselves clearly enough at all, because they're wanting to surprise you, and they're going to be exaggerating, and they might very often be hostile to what they seem to be supporting, and that's a kind of silence in a text that students can look for, and it helps them gather information, and it helps them have some confidence that they are being asked to say what's not there that could be there or should be there to
right.
help
So
the text go.
Right. So it's a matter of expectation. You might expect
Right.
to see something there, it's not, and so that leads to the question, why is it not there? Okay, great. If there are no other questions about the material on this slide, why don't we move ahead to our next?
All right. Here we have come up with a kind of building block approach to the kinds of questions you might ask. First, of particular words or phrases in a text, what are their connotations? A great question in this group is, what would happen if you used a different word than the one that's there? What would happen if that word weren't there and another one were? And you might substitute a different word yourself, or let your students substitute some other words and play around with why the word that is there is the one that is necessary for the interpretation and the connections that you want to make. At the word level, it's the place to get to the difference between literal and denotative meanings, and the more symbolic and inferential and subjective meanings of the text, and does a word embody those? Repetition I like very much to use in reading of any kind of text, because when a writer keeps repeating a word or slight variations on that word, those are wonderful kind of red bullet target points where the writer is repeating because he wants to emphasize this is his key point, this is his main subject, and he's going to keep repeating that word and also changing that word a little bit every now and then to help progress in his thinking. And so you really want to look for repetition. So there are a lot of questions at the word level. There are many questions at the sentence level. And here, of course, you're going to be teaching some writing as well as some reading, as students need to have some sense of how sentences work. If the same sentence type is repeated, boom, 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 several simple declarative sentences, well, then something in that sentence is usually going to be connected to the next one. It's almost like a list format if you're setting them up with the same grammatical structure, for instance. Matters of organization, how we move from one point to another. Asking students to look at that. Where are the transitions? Where are the points where the subject matter changes and moves forward? Again, these are concrete things they can always look for, and they pay that kind of evidence search. Focusing on paragraphs. Again, as paragraphs are ways of announcing, I'm on to something new now, but it's got to relate back to what I just said. So the beginning of a new paragraph is a stop and look signal that you're going to be finding a new way of presenting information, or you're going to be layering another piece of information on top of an old one. So all these questions for paragraph structures are important. And then, of course, focusing on the whole through questions that relate to what's going on throughout the whole text. And again, the text itself helps you create the questions that you're going to be wanting to ask. Not every single question at any of these levels will be useful. And now we're going to show how this works just for a few minutes with a newspaper article that I just lifted one day just to see, okay, what can a news article do? And how might we read one? And this one comes from the Los Angeles Times, and it's describing a drive through the countryside in Afghanistan, a minivan taxi that crossed a river and then jostled and bumped on an unpaved road. The border policeman sat with the ordinary passengers. His buddy lay in a coffin fastened to the roof. Praised be God for Zabuila, written on the wood. The others got off at a bus station, and the taxi, the policeman, and the coffin continued along the main road in northeastern Afghanistan's Kapisa province. In each village they stopped at, nobody knew the dead man. It was 4 p.m. when the taxi pulled up next to the Naki Khalil Primary School and a store with a rusty metal machine that churned out vanilla soft-serve ice cream. The border policeman asked shopkeepers whether the dead man's family was from the area. All he had was a name, Zabuila Aga. So, using the previous list that we had at the word level, you might zero in on just the vanilla soft serve ice cream. Why that one? Well, it's striking. It strikes you. It strikes you perhaps as being terribly irrelevant, especially put next to in another very striking passage, the coffin fastened to the roof. But for the very reason that it seems so so out of place in this setting to mention vanilla soft serve ice cream being churned out. It might very well be a word that you want to ask your students about. You might want to ask them, well, what if we just substituted ice cream or sandwich shop, or in the courtyard someone was skinning a lamb? What is it about the vanilla soft serve ice cream as a detail in this piece? Why did the writer want that there? And if they've been looking at other words previous to that, you might say, what about vanilla? Well, vanilla is pretty just ordinary, isn't it? And I may be jumping to conclusions, but notice how in that very first paragraph, the border policeman is in that taxi with ordinary passengers who then leave the taxi. And so among many extraordinary things going on as the policeman tries to get this body home, ordinary life, the churning out of soft-serve ice cream is going on all around. And it's not symbolism necessarily, but it's words being used to shock and to make you think and to also get you into a scene in a way that it would be very useful to talk about at the word level. Sentence structure. Take a look at the number of simple subject verbs The minivan crossed the river. The border policeman sat. His buddy lay. The others got off. And then the structures change. But you have all these simple kind of declarative sentences. And you have a kind of parallelism. Notice the border policeman sat with the ordinary passages. His buddy lay in a coffin. Notice that parallelism, the subject, verb, and then the huge contrast with the buddy is on the roof in the coffin. How does the writer develop the paragraphs here? Well, we're proceeding here through motion as well as through geography. We're moving from one place to another place to another place. And then another thing that's happening in terms of the way this passage, this excerpt is organized, is that with each paragraph we're getting more and more specific. And what are we looking for? Finally, we're looking for a name. We're looking for a place to go with all we have, and all we have is the man's name. So the structure is organized to do that, to keep giving us more and more and more information that is more and more and more specific, because this border policeman is looking for something so specific, the family of this dead buddy of his. Now, point of view, think about that. Is there anything in this particular excerpt that would give us a key to the point of view or the tone? And again, you might say, well, is the writer's tone one of familiarity? Is it one of detachment? Is it one of great distance? Is it one of bitterness? Is it sad, and what makes it sad? And what words would tell us this? Well, there aren't many, but there are some interesting ones. Ordinary, for one thing. He's telling us that the border policeman and the buddy in the coffin are not ordinary. He gives us the phrase, "Praise be God for Zabuila." So someone sees this dead buddy in the coffin as a hero, and is there kind of a quiet heroism? Does this become a kind of quest? And so that the tone can be said to be almost reverential. Again, by zeroing in on particular language within the text itself, you can come to these kinds of interpretive statements through strategies that just get you into the evidence that's right before you.
Cindy, we talked earlier about strategic silences, and it seems to me that in that first paragraph there are a lot of strategic silences,
Right.
and that Ned Parker is using that as a way to get us into the story. We don't know who the border policeman is. We do know that Zabuila, maybe he's in the coffin. We have no idea how he got there and why that's on top of the minivan. It could have started in any number of more any number of more expository ways, but he's really withheld a lot of information here, hasn't he?
Yes, he has, and of course, especially if you relate the excerpt to the title. An Afghan farmer tills under his dreams for his son. You're getting pathos, but you're also getting a lot of questions that lead you into that text, and why we don't know more than we know, and what it means that we don't know. We are until the second paragraph. We don't even know exactly where we are, but we do know that somebody was churning vanilla ice cream.
Yeah, it is an incongruous detail. We do have here, one of our participants has detected hints of irony here. Is the word buddy used ironically? Why did the border policeman not know the dead man's origin if he was indeed a buddy? So that's another question. How close are they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that using the strategic silences so dramatically so early in the text could slow the reader down. Perhaps that was the intention. Yes, I think that's a good observation, and I think it was to slow the reader down.
Right.
Yeah.
And a good
okay.
question to ask students. Why is he going so slowly?
Mm-hmm.
And he's moving on a difficult road that makes him go slowly in a literal sense. So all of those things are working together in this text. Okay.
Okay.
Great. Okay. As we will begin to be looking at some of the Common Core exemplar texts for this particular evening, and these are history and informational texts, we often hear that nonfiction is simply a progression of facts or information, and that's all we're looking for is just the facts, and that other matters and the language tools we've been talking about are not important. I think certainly my response to this would be that any good writing, and the last piece, that article in the Los Angeles Times, is proof that all good writing employs language tools. Writers use the devices that help them in persuading and in getting people to an understanding, and not just any old, I can summarize your argument, but so that readers feel the impact. They know more, and they're impressed, and they're engaged. That's what all literary or language devices, and they're not just literary devices, are meant to do. And good writing, no matter where you find it, in a manual or in a anthology of poetry, is going to have devices and tools that make close reading very useful. And as we said before, the contextualizing elements can loom large as well when we're working with this. So let's get to some samples. And here we have the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, a Common Core text that is used in literature courses as well as history courses and political science courses, I dare say. So, and here is the title page that does a great deal of contextualizing for us. And we want to think first about why these contextualizing elements are important. So we have announced for us who wrote it, when it was published, where it was published. Is there a sense from just the title page on who the intended audience was, and what? And of course, a wonderful question that can be taken from these contextualizing elements that come before the narrative itself is that photograph. And what's the relationship between that photograph, that picture of Douglass, and the text itself, and even just the title page itself? So these are the kinds of questions that students will be asking, and if they have this information, it's going to throw lights on the sections and all the passages that are to come. This is a slave who is writing. He is a slave who is writing his own narrative, which is stressed double by the little fact written by himself. It was published in 1845 in Boston. What's the importance of that? Well, we know that what a hotbed Boston was, and we know that 1845 is the beginning of the really heating up of the abolitionist arguments against slavery. So all of those things can take us to something we will be coming to, and will come from our own first readings and readings of the text, and also how we're wanting to use that text ourselves. So we have this understanding that is overarching, and that is either the beginning or the end of our process, and in some ways it's both. The passage that we're going to look at, in this passage, Douglass discovers that the denial of learning is the very source of his oppression, and he understands that literacy is going to lead him from slavery to freedom. So with that understanding in our minds, as teachers, we go to the text with our students. And here are some of the questions that we can use to kind of re-engineer the whole process of what students are going to do as they read to reach the understanding of the passage that comes from the evidence, and that we hope that they will take on with them and connect to other points in our unit. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. After I'd learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. To use his own words further, he said, if you give a nigger an inch, he will take an ell. A nigger should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. Now, he said, if you teach that nigger, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. So, in this passage, a first question based on just the first couple of sentences might be, what image of himself is Douglas presenting? Just in these first 2 sentences. And of course, it's teacher-student. He's the student. He's a very elementary student. He's having to learn his ABCs. So when we ask what words create that image, that's what we can look at. She is teaching him. She is teaching him the most primary elements of the shaping of words that there is. We might want to get to that point by simply asking, okay, why does he use ABC instead of taught me my alphabet? What's the difference in those 2 words, you see? Notice that from describing the teaching and paraphrasing Mr. Auld's words to him, he finally lets Mr. Auld speak for himself. And what happens when that happens? That's a point your students can find in this text where all of a sudden we're getting direct address from Mr. Auld to Mrs. Auld. And how does that change things for us? How does it change our attitudes towards Mr. Auld? When he's summarizing his argument, it's one thing, but when he begins to make his own argument, what happens? And then, of course, when Douglas interjects himself into Mr. Auld's own words, speaking of myself, he says, after Mr. Auld has used the N-word to describe him 4 different times in a row, you see. What effect does that have as we now understand that Douglas is standing there listening while Mr. Auld talks about him in this way? What's the effect of that? And can you ask students where they see that effect happening in the text?
Okay. So if we could go back to this slide for a moment, maybe we could just take an opportunity here to ask our participants if they see any other questions that they might frame, or to make this make a firmer connection here between this passage and our understanding, which, if you remember, says that in this passage, Douglas discovers the denial of learning, the source of his oppression, and it represents the starting point of his journey from innocence to experience. Any other questions out there that you might frame to link this passage to our understanding? Anything? Okay. His syntax, the first 2 sentences also reflect an intentional tone of refinement. It's almost like he's mocking them by using his own style of speech juxtaposed to simplicity and absurdity. Okay? All right?
Yeah. I would certainly want to ask the students what characterizes Mr. Auld's speech in comparison to Frederick Douglass's speech.
Right.
What's the difference between them?
Right.
And is Douglas making a judgment simply by the different kinds of diction and style and tone? Yeah.
Good point. Any other questions? Any other potential questions? Okay. Well, let's keep that in mind. Let's move ahead then to the next passage in this section, and keep that in mind, folks. If you have any ideas for other close reading questions that would work here, please suggest them for us.
As the passage goes on, Frederick Douglass writes. And he begins to write of his own response to the words he has heard as he is standing right there, finding out why he shouldn't be taught to read. These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. So, within this passage, of course, and the one previous, we understand better that contextualizing element that by the end of the 1830s, every southern state had passed very strict laws against the teaching of reading and writing. And Mr. Auld has says it's unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. So we have this the prescription that gives us a sense of why a whole national framework of law was imposed on slaves in this sense. We have the multiple perspectives as Frederick Douglass begins to project his response to reading against Mr. Auld. Remember what Mr. Auld said, it's going to make him very unmanageable and unhappy. Well, look at what Frederick Douglass says that knowledge is going to make him. It's opening up a whole new world. He now has something he prizes, a new train of thought. So it's there's a good bit of irony in this. Again, the contrast between Mr. Auld's prescriptions against with Douglass's endorsement of literacy, and also the withholding of that wonderful understanding that he has come to the end. He has said these words sank in, and they're new sentiments and a new train of thought. He describes that train of thought and those sentiments at great length before he actually tells us what the train of thought and the new sentiments are. So it comes with special force, kind of an explosive force there at the end. Sentence structure, notice the many different uses of different kinds of devices. The parallelism of the two match sentence, a grand achievement. I prized it highly. I had struggled, but struggled in vain. The rhythm of the sentences is, again, almost simply on Douglass's part, a boasting of, okay, I am now writing this as a man about what I learned in a boy, and look at how well I learned to write. I'm pulling out all the stops. I'm using all the language tools that any great writer might use.
Okay, we have some really good comments here. One participant writes regarding the last question about the why did Douglass withhold the thesis till the end of the piece. I like the way Douglass withholds the thesis until the end because the reader shares the discovery along with Douglass. A really good point. He brings you along with him and you come to the same epiphany. We have another comment too, another potential question. Look at the personification in the fourth sentence. What kind of image do those words represent? How does it help what Douglass is trying to say? Let's see, I'm not entirely sure which one we're calling here as the fourth sentence. Perhaps that you might want to clarify that one. But certainly that is the kind of question that you'd want, and that is certainly a text-dependent question. So two very good comments here.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, as you ask students to zero in, the white man's power to enslave the black man. Again, he's setting up this dichotomy, both through diction and style and use of language. And then in this sentence, white man and black man. So all of those things are right there in that text for students to deal with.
Okay, we've got clarification on that fourth sentence. These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments, lay slumbering, right, personification of the words. Yeah, that would be an excellent point for to bring up. Those words now are alive and they're having a real impact on Douglas. Excellent point. Good close reading point. Yeah.
Yeah, and it comes right out of those words. Okay. Oh, we've got some other great text and not a whole lot of time, so we're going to move to another one that's a Common Core exemplar text, Amy Tan's essay called Mother Tongue, in which she explores how the ways in which our language use and how we speak and write shapes our identity, and our identity being how we define who we are and how we are seen by others. So with that understanding in mind that came out of the reading, a close reading of this text, and that you want to be directing your students toward through their use of evidence in the text, here is Amy Tan's paragraph. Lately, I've been giving more thought to the kind of English my mother speaks. Like others, I've described it to people as broken or fractured English, but I wince when I say that. It has always bothered me that I can think of no other way to describe it other than broken, as if it were damaged and needed to be fixed, as if it lacked a certain wholeness or soundness. I've heard other terms used, limited English, for example, but they seem just as bad as if everything is limited, including people's perceptions of the limited English speaker. And again, here's a place where repetition will lead us to the thesis, broken, and then a whole paragraph which defines what the word broken means, both connotatively and denotatively. Brokenness becomes limitedness, and notice it's not just English that is broken, it is the speaker who is broken. And the tying of the mother's speech as being broken to herself as being limited and broken is a key way that the understanding we're trying to reach. It proposed we are how we speak, and there are lots of different ways that Amy Tan gets that across in this paragraph. In the next paragraph, she goes on, and I won't read this one because we want to get to some other text, but as she goes through here, she asks lots of questions that she is asked as a writer. And primarily they boil down to the fact that it doesn't seem that Asian Americans are very good writers, and so they're usually steered to something else that they do better because they come from limited and broken places. Again, the repetition of the words that were in the first paragraph as she shows how people try to move Asian Americans because of their limitedness away from using language. She goes on to talk about herself as a rebel and how she rebelled particularly against this perception of brokenness. And finally, she goes on to talk about becoming a writer herself and how she herself thought she was going to write. And she gives us a wonderful example of what mastery of English looked like for her when she gives us this sentence that is supposedly going to be the opposite of broken English because she's mastered English. And so she gives us the sentence, "That was my mental quandary in its nascent state." And she tells us it's a terrible line. Well, a wonderful question is to students, now why is this line terrible? Especially why is it terrible when it's an example of Tan having mastered English, so that students can get into the difference between brokenness and mastery and the irony of her use of those terms. Because especially when we move on to the next paragraph, she says how she learned from her lack of real understanding of language tools to use her mother as her reader. And notice she begins to give us some ideas of the kind of achievements she wanted to make. Well, she's going to have to use simple language. She's going to have to use watered down Chinese. But in doing that, you note she's going to say, I wanted to capture what language ability tests can never reveal. Her intent, her passion, her imagery. Notice the parallels of the listing, the rhythms of her speech, and the nature of her thoughts. And so as students look at her descriptions, again, ironic because they are supposedly watered down and too simple and broken, we see that she's finding the power of speech in something that no one has let her consider is good writing. And finally, the culmination, the final point, apart from what any critic had to say about my writing, I knew I had succeeded where it counted when my mother finished reading my book and gave me her verdict. So easy to read. And a final question we might ask at that point, is that broken English, that comment? So,
Cindy, we have one participant responded to the question about why that last sentence in the previous 2 slides was terrible, and she writes here, or he writes, because it was showing off her English mastery, and of course meaning that ironically. I think that, you know, one of the veins you could pursue here in this piece is the extent to which Amy Tan discovers herself and who she is by confronting her Chinese language heritage, because at the end, you know, she's talking about the translations she's going to make in her work, and that's, you know, she's also there, I think, talking about the translation she's going to make in her own cultural identity. Watered down Chinese, American, English. I think you could mine her own journey toward realization of her identity here. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Oh, sure. I think so. And notice how her her attempt to find her own language does take her back to the Chinese language and to her own roots in another culture that has been misconceived as it has been Americanized, which she has shown us by showing where people tried to make her put her abilities in some other area than being able to talk the way in a way that would show herself who she was. Yeah.
Okay, we've got about a little over 20 minutes or so to go, but I want to warn everybody we're probably going to go over this evening because we've got a lot of really good material yet that I think is very important. So be prepared, stay with us. I think you'll find it worthwhile. So shall we move ahead?
Sure. Let's and notice we're moving here from excerpts that are not primarily perhaps literary in terms of their author's purposes, but which are stylized by people who are writing with a very fine sense of what literary style is. When we get to this next reading, this is from a book by a business consultant, a very popular one named Jim Collins. This is a reading from his book called Good to Great and the Social Sectors. And it's a kind of reading that you might get in a business course, or simply read if you're trying by yourself to figure out how to run a business or how to work in the social sciences. And so as we look at it, again, does it have the kind of language tools within it that would make it profit from close reading? From the excerpt that we're going to look at, we have come to this understanding that Collins builds classic elements of argumentation into a narrative that moves us to assent to the proposition that what we normally consider business thinking is not the sole province of business at all. So with that in mind, we'll take a look at the excerpt in its several paragraphs. And here's paragraph 1, in which he tells us we must reject the idea, well-intentioned but dead wrong, that the primary path to greatness in the social sectors is to become, quote, more like a business, unquote. Most businesses, like most anything else in life, fall somewhere between mediocre and good. Few are great. When you compare great companies with good ones, many widely practiced business norms turn out to correlate with mediocrity, not greatness. So then why would we want to import the practices of mediocrity into the social sectors? So what do you have a student do with this? Well, a good place to start is the very first sentence and asking a pretty important question. Who are we? And why does Collins say, I want you to reject the idea, or I reject the idea? Why does he want that collective we as a strategy of presentation and as a way to persuade? We're talking here, of course, about rhetorical devices that are used in making arguments effective, and they are extremely important language tools, but they also lend themselves very productively to close reading. So as we look at his rhetorical device of putting us all in the same boat, we find that through his collectivization of we all agree about this and we're all going to be doing this together. That's a starting point for getting you into his camp where you're going to agree with his argument. Notice here the use of repetition of key words. Notice the oppositions that supposedly set up between businesses and the social sectors. And then, of course, the opposition between greatness, goodness, and mediocrity. And so we have two different kinds of oppositions going on, that between quality, greatness versus mediocrity, and that between two supposedly entirely different kinds of endeavor, that is social sectors and corporate businesses. So we begin with, by close reading, we have a sense of those oppositions, and Collins is going to play with those oppositions all the way through. In the next couple of paragraphs, notice he takes us to a place, a real place where there are gathered a very particular kind of audience. He identifies his audience here as CEOs, that is, business executives, successful businessmen, after he's made this contrast between business and social sectors. And notice he does kind of what Douglas does. He has a particular person raise his hand and become very individualized as he asks a question that is going to attack Collins's own position. And that position is that he thinks businesses and nonprofits are very, very different in the way they operate, and in a way that, of course, valorizes the business model over the social sector model. And now Jim, speaking not as we but as I, responds to that argument. So we have this wonderful dialectic going on between two men in dialogue, and one questioning and the other answering, and they're on two different sides of the fence here. But notice as Jim takes the argument in paragraph 3, how he uses repetition, disciplined people, disciplined thought, disciplined action, and relates those to that word great. But then notice he negates that it's a principle of business. It's a principle of greatness. So now notice what he's done. He's taken one separation and opposition between business and social sector, and now there's another opposition between business and greatness. Business doesn't necessarily mean greatness. And business isn't necessarily different from the social sector. So just with his way of juxtaposing words, greatness, goodness, business, social sector, and then injecting what makes greatness, the word discipline, discipline, discipline. He's moving his argument forward and subtly altering what is opposed to what in a way that you have to follow closely. And when you do, you see his point.
Penny, if I could just interject here.
Sure.
He really is a skillful arguer. In his first paragraph, he really embeds a syllogism in there. Most human endeavors are mediocre. Business is a human endeavor, therefore businesses are mediocre. That's his argument. And then in the second paragraph, he has somebody come along and challenge that. And in the third paragraph, he refutes the challenge. That's classic argumentation. Argument, challenge, refutation.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as we'll see, he sort of uses very, very skillful methods of argumentation to win our assent, and we're hardly even aware that we're assenting to it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Notice he moves the time frame, and he moves us. Now we're at dinner. We're continuing the debate, but we've progressed in time, and now he has a question for his questioner. And the question is, would you have done things differently if you were in the social sector? And notice within that question, he embeds the kinds of practices that lead to greatness, but not just in business, also in the social sector. Would you have been less likely to practice enlightened leadership, put less energy into getting the right people on the bus, been less demanding of results? Notice here, he's giving you the practices that make for greatness, as he asked this CEO if he would have done those things differently if he had been a university president instead of the chairman of a big corporation. And notice he dramatizes the capitulation of his adversary. His adversary actually gives in and gives up and agrees with him. No, I suspect not. So you see his embedded questioner, who might be all of us, is taken to the mat very happily by the way he has framed his questions to him, and by the way he now gives us, his other audience, the same out, that this fellow's now going to agree with him. But then notice he's not gloating. He shows himself as thinking and changing and evolving and growing in his own response to his own argument. That's when it dawned on me we need a new language. The critical distinction, and of course he's been trying to make that all along, is not between business and social, but between great and good, you see. So he's abolished that opposition with which he started, and he has come up with a new opposition that his audience is going to have to choose goodness or greatness, and he's going to show them how to choose greatness. So, a very effective place to teach argument, but also to teach students how to read arguments by looking at the way information is manipulated and also the way it is evolved. This argument comes across through steady, relentless, forward-moving, with all the balls always in the air, good repetition to keep us in mind of what's opposed to what, and interest in using some colloquial, down-to-earth question and answering techniques, and all of that is available in the text for the student to read.
Mm-hmm. And he also does it by giving us a little scene. There's a little drama here between him and Mr. Weekly. And you're right, when Weekly gives in, we give in too. We see him winning assent, and we're prepared to assent as well. We have here a participant noting it would be fun to parallel this to Plato's Republic and dialogues there. Yes, it would be. That would be a very challenging and interesting assignment.
Oh, I think so. I think that's the whole point of close reading. It can text together in ways that we never even dreamed, where we can make really interesting assumptions both about history and political science and style, all in one comparison.
Well, let me stop here and ask, are there any questions about this good to great social sector before we move on? Anything coming over the transom? Okay. Well, Cindy, let's go on to the most gripping text we have this evening. I mean, you're not going to be able to put this down, folks.
And as I remarked earlier when I was speaking to Richard about this, I said only an English teacher could figure out a way that the more you read this, the more you get out of it. But it's true. The more I read it, the more I saw, and that's close reading at its best payoff. Because this is a Common Core text exemplar, and it comes from Fed Views by Eric Swanson. That is, it's from the Federal Reserve Bank, and it's a typical genre. We might call it a memo. It might be a kind of task force report, but in any case, the understanding, that is the point that Eric Swanson is trying to set up, is really a forecast, predictions based on facts that he's going to give us, and the way he gives them to us becomes a very interesting study in language use and how to get the most out of an informational text. So let's take a look, and here it is. Notice we have graphs that go along with the reading, and of course one of the goals in the close reading standards is to be able to relate the visuals to the print reading excerpt. And so here's a graph that will show in a different visual format what is going to be said by Eric Swanson. So in paragraph 1, he begins to talk about statistics, labor statistics, employees, and how many jobs there are for them. We're going to look primarily at the next 3 paragraphs that follow this one, where he is simply giving us one fact after another about who is working in non-farm and how many and how fast payrolls are growing, and how many employees are employed now. And then finally in this paragraph there's a dramatic shortfall. Notice kind of the dramatic statement of that particular fact that comes from reading the earlier facts. The next 3 paragraphs, notice how paragraph 2 continues to talk about unemployment, unemployment, unemployment. And in this kind of writing, of course, one of the things you don't want is synonyms, and you don't want to substitute words for each other. You're concentrating on unemployment, and so you're going to repeat the word unemployment. That's the topic. What's happening to the unemployment rate is what is being analyzed, and so in a very toneless, we might say, and speakerless presentation of facts, we get in paragraph 2 what's happening on the unemployment scene. Notice the switch, though. After several more paragraphs that simply do this, we have in paragraph 8 little change in our forecast. And notice we have changed. We now have a speaker, again a collective speaker, we and us, and who are we becomes an important question, and the particular context out of which this memo or report has come becomes particularly important to go back to and to see. This comes from the Federal Reserve itself, and it has that kind of authority. But notice Eric Swanson says, we think. here that gross domestic product expanded at about 3.2% annual rate. It's not that it did, but we think it did. And now, of course, we're being introduced to what Eric Swanson is going to do. He's going to be making interpretations from his facts. He's analyzed his facts, and now he is coming up with his interpretation of his facts. He thinks this is true. It's a forecast. It's a prediction. It's not just fact anymore. Later on, he says, we expect, and then we expect, and growth is likely, you see. So we've gone from fact to speculation. And the language change that brings us to this point reinforces what we can do with facts. And that, of course, then notice in the next paragraph, we're on to something new. We're not talking just about unemployment anymore. We're talking about inflation. And again, notice the switch. We're back to a kind of speakerless, non-toned presentation of some specific percentages. And then the prediction and the forecast comes much quickly here for inflation. Okay, we have these facts. Now we expect. And so the final analysis is going to show us this kind of blending of fact. And, well, I've sort of answered my own question here. I should have moved on to these. Can we do close reading with this kind of dry memo? Well, the answer is, why not? But, again, what kind of questions do you want to use? And here the questions certainly involve some of the contextualizing. Can we infer the purpose? And can we infer from within the reading itself, who's it written for? Well, it certainly isn't written for just anybody, is it? Part of who it's written for can be determined by asking the question, why would anybody want to read this? What is somebody looking for if they go to this website and read this report? And when you can answer that, what are they looking for? Well, they're looking for some facts about unemployment and inflation. You can find that in the text. And then you want to know, well, what do you do with these facts? What can these facts help us do? And you're on to the forecast, the prediction. And the word forecast leaped out at me when I read this. It's a word that changes everything. It's no longer just dry fact. We're able to predict the future on the basis of this. So these are some of the questions that can repay this kind of reading. And then more finely grained questions. Charting the progression ideas, that switch into a we who are thinking and expecting and evaluating and predicting and forecasting. Is there a character? Well, there is for a little while, you see. When we begin to think and we have expectations, which are almost hopes, we're having to make interpretations about things that might be true. The verbs themselves move from simple stated verbs to conditional verbs. We have a however in there that is a qualifying statement. And so we have language use that helps us to characterize the tone and the purpose of all of this factual information.
Cindy, we have a number of comments here about that editorial we, which I think is really important because although this is written by one person, Eric Swanson, he is talking for the Federal Reserve. And so that figures into this subtle argument that he's making, wouldn't it? I mean, this is not just Eric Swanson, a senior research analyst, talking. This is the Federal Reserve. And so in one sense, could we say that he's arguing from authority here?
Oh, very much so, and it's a way of establishing his authority. It's a very interesting line because he's personalizing, as well as he is also almost elevating his position to that of I am Federal Reserve. so it's a very interesting use of language that he really can't avoid
Yeah.
bringing it in that way, but it can also work to his favor by associating him with something larger than himself.
Right. Yeah, if it was the views of Eric Swanson, it might be easier to dismiss, but here it's Eric Swanson using that grand editorial we, summoning all of the power of the Federal Reserve behind him.
Yeah, he moves from fact to forecast, and it's in that move from fact to forecast where he really has to inject the human element of interpreter instead of simply, bringer of knowledge. He's an interpreter of knowledge too.
Right. I think we have one more slide on this one.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, there's another set of questions. Is he making an argument? We saw that he is, although he's not making it any kind of traditional way. What strategy does he employ? You mentioned earlier, he accumulates facts, and he also infuses those facts with authority by that editorial we.
Yeah, and he is making an argument, because notice in paragraph 8 he said the recovery should gradually pick up steam. That's a sentence that might be the one that strikes a reader in that paragraph. That is, he's opening the bag to okay, this is what I think these facts mean. This should happen. Yeah.
Right. Another way he gives the argument authority here is by not including anything that would challenge his facts. We saw in the Collins piece, Collins brought up a refutation to his argument, and then he refuted the refutation. Swanson here does not say, other people may say that this is going to happen, but we assert that here he's just straightforward. He does not include any challenge to his views.
Yes, exactly, and that's again, he's got the facts, he's got the authority, he is the Federal Reserve. This is the way to see it, and that's of course the function of the Federal Reserve. They really are trying to promote their argument to influence the way the economy works.
Yeah. So he's
less likely to include any kind of dissonance.
Right, and so he's omitted that classic structure of argument, refutation, and then counter-argument, and he's also omitted here any of the kind of words that you would see in an argument, any kind of transitions like therefore, thus, words that point to a logical conclusion. This is, these paragraphs are fairly discrete. The transitions between them, they're there, of course, but they're not those kind of logical transitions that move you along in an argument. You have to put those in yourself. Right, and it is it is all the way through. It is, this is the way to see it. Yeah. And the graphs, if you look closely at the graphs, they extend what he's saying over time. Here, this is a snapshot, January 12th, 2012. But if you look at that graph, he's got figures that go all the way back to 2001. So it extends what he's saying over time. Right. Yeah. Well, somebody wrote, how would you, it'd be very difficult to reel students into this kind of text, and I admit that it would. I don't know quite where you would teach it, maybe in an economics class, I don't know, but it is a Common Core exemplar text, and it was it was a real challenge, we wanted to show you that close reading could be done with things that seem to defy the kind of close analysis we've been giving all night. I mean, we've come a long way from Frederick Douglass's very charged and literary language to this very uncharged and bureaucratic language. Yes, but I would love to use it in a writing class. Yeah, I think, a writing class, it would work. It would. This is what students are going to encounter, and to be able to come to it with some strategies that this is how to read something like this. You look for the way facts are presented, the way tone changes. You want to find out his purpose as well as his information, and so you create questions that help you get to that purpose. Yeah, that's what they're arguing in the Common Core. When students graduate from school and they're asked to do writing assignments for their work, they're not going to be asked to write a sensitive account of what they did last summer. They're going to be asked to do reports, memos, this sort of thing. So they wanted to introduce this kind of real-world writing into the curriculum. And I hope we've given you some ideas about how you might approach this sort of thing. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've gone a little bit over, and I appreciate you staying with us. We have come to the end. Are there any final comments or questions before we wrap this up tonight? Anything else coming in over the transom? Okay, I don't see anything in the chat there, so let me, Cindy, thank you for another fine seminar. I really appreciate it. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot to work with, and I want to thank our participants for their attention and their patience and their participation this evening. Please remember that we'll be monitoring the forum through January 31st. You can send us your questions and comments, and we'll get back to you with them. Check our AmericaInClass.org for our upcoming seminars, and don't forget our America in Class lessons. I think they'll help you teach according to the Common Core. Please submit your evaluations. I hope you'll join us again. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us, and good evening.